So, welcome here to the next session taking place in Silicon Valley, which is a bit of a lie because I'm sitting here in Aarhus and one of the guests here is sitting in Hamburg, but Richard Gingrich, he's actually sitting right there with his coat on in freezing California, but right in the middle of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley built by engineers and who have changed the world for the last 25 years. It has changed the way we live our lives. It has reformed, revolutionized closed industries. It's about how we shop, how we pay, how we date, how we book, how we find information, and how we communicate. Everything has been revolutionized for the last 25 years. And one sector of the industry has been revolutionized maybe more than anyone else, meaning the media industry. Journalism has been changed because the habits of news consumers is rapidly changing due to technology, partly. So we're sitting here and we're talking with two representatives of some of the most successful companies of Silicon Valley, but also in the world. Companies that have changed into becoming the most powerful also media companies in the world. So I'm very proud to welcome to this session Jesper Dub, who is working for Facebook Europe on news partnerships, and Vice President for Google News, Richard Gingrich from Google. And we have just heard on the former session out of Kansas City about news deserts. News deserts as a result of us doing bad journalism, and some of the financial model being eroded, mainly because new companies such like yours, Facebook and Google, are so much better at being the go-between between advertisers and the consumer. So what has financed journalism is going to some other companies, right? We could talk about a lot of things about your companies, and it's been done all over again in conferences everywhere. We could talk about the business models. We could talk about the business model on collecting data about us and all the issues about privacy. We could talk about monopolies. We could talk about a lot of stuff. But this is about journalism. So let's talk for once about content. That's the idea. So let me start with you, Richard Gingrich. You have been working with tech even before the internet was invented, I think, for a very long time. And of all the people I know in the media world, you're probably one of the best at looking ahead and sees what is coming and the result of technology to journalism and the news industry. So could you start being extremely honest here and say, could you personally, thinking back 10 years ago or 15 years ago, did you imagine not only all the good stuff coming out of the internet revolution, and we could talk about that for days, but what about, did you foresee the flip side of this for news, for journalism, and mostly about for polarization, for mistrust, and for the public debate and democracy?
No, I did not. And as you point out, I've been working in the digital sphere for 40 years. My first digital news product was in 1980. So I have been at this quite a long time. And whereas on the one side, it was very, very clear to many of us of what a significant impact these new technologies would have, particularly with the dawning of the internet. The internet changes everything. It opens up tremendously broad marketplaces for information, marketplaces for services. That is, of course, will often by definition be disruptive of existing players. And we can talk about that. That, I think, was not unreasonable to expect on the part of folks who are close to it. I think what was surprising was, as you point out, was the introduction of significant issues with regard to misinformation, polarization of views and positions as people access information from various sources. That was a surprise to me. It probably shouldn't have been. I mean, if I look back, one of the drivers of my career has been the expansion of media distribution. Initially that meant satellite networks, and then it was cable networks, and then it was the internet, based on just a pure belief that to the extent that one could broaden access to tools for information, that was a great thing for societies, right? I'm a huge believer in free expression. And the internet does indeed enable free expression beyond anything we've seen in the history of human civilization, right? Anyone has access to the ability to publish information, and just as importantly, anyone in the world has access to find information that maps to their views. And therein comes the rub, in a sense, because we have now facilitated the ability for people to indeed not only promulgate false information, but others to find information that confirms their biases. That was I think I had always believed that our better angels would leverage these capabilities for good. And there's no question a lot of that good happened. But maybe I should have paid more attention to my readings of Plato as I was in college, because frankly, he predicted this as probably better than anyone else, of recognizing that open societies and open democracies would, in a sense, suffer great challenges based on the freedoms that they allow with regard to, for instance, free expression specifically. So that has been a big surprise. And not only, by the way, of that use and abuse of information provision coming from, say, fringe players, but it's also coming from governments, it's coming from mainstream players as well. And I think it obviously is presenting our society with huge challenges, which I'm sure we can discuss in significant detail. I would like to think I would have expected all that, but I did not.
Did you expect that your company and a company much younger than yours, for Facebook, would be so enormous forces in our societies as they have become now?
I mean, it was clear to many of us. I can remember back in the 90s, I was working at Apple, when we was with the dawning of the internet. And it was clear that this was going to be a very, very significant thing. However, going from that to any predictions of a specific company like Google, and I've been at Google for more than a decade, would rise to the positions they're in. I can't say as I fully expected that, though clearly there have been indications along the way that indeed would be the case. But this is a very, very different and interesting environment, even when you look at the roles of the key players, because I think it's important to recognize the extraordinarily different dynamics of this media ecosystem versus any we've seen in the past. And that is primarily the attribute of its openness.
Would it be okay to say that even you are worried to what you see? You can see there are things we have to work on. There are things that your companies have to work on as well in order to find a way to fix what we're entering right now.
Oh, without question. I think if we're not worried about the evolution of the internet and its impact on our open society and open democracies, then we should be. As I've put it, and you've heard me talk about this at great length, I think the most puzzling question facing us today is how does one manage environments of free expression? Which is an interesting conundrum, because those of us who believe thoroughly in free expression believe that you should not control it in any fashion. But that is indeed a very significant societal question. And I think it ultimately will rise to our leaders in all dimensions of our society to make sure that we're setting, as I often say, we're societies that are ruled by laws, but in truth, the health of our societies is driven by norms.
Mm.
And this really comes down to our leaders in government, politics, public policy, technology companies, media companies, rising to the occasion to set norms of informational behavior that can allow our societies to have access to healthy, credible information to be able to manage their societies in a healthy way.
And one of the companies that have been most criticized for spreading misinformation and not living up to responsibility has been the tech companies and of course Facebook, which Jesper, you joined only 2 years ago, so you're pretty new into this, where Richard has been there for a lifetime. But you're pretty new, and you actually came out of news, right? You were running the Spiegel Online newsroom, and so is it fair to say just a few years ago, also when you had discussions with Facebook, because I know I was part of some of that discussions, and you were sitting on my side of the table, and at that time I remember we tried to persuade Facebook to understand, and other tech companies such as Google, that it was not good enough to say they were just platforms, neutral platforms. Isn't that true? When did that change, Jesper? When did you realize you are a media company?
I think we are still not what I would call a media company in the sense of what a media company is. One of the most important aspects of it is probably that we do not produce content ourselves. So I think we play a major role in distributing media and news content. And when you look at how Facebook came about, in the initial years of Facebook, a publisher or a newsroom would not even consider putting any of their content onto Facebook because it was not about that. What Facebook has grown into is a massive network of connected people around the world. And of course, with access to that audience, there's an idea that you can get your journalism out there, and you can connect with people that you might have had limits to reach in your classic world, and your way of reaching it through your own and operated websites or your apps or in the traditional form of print. And I think that was appealing. But if you look at the way that Facebook was built, and the central element of Facebook today still is what we call the news feed, so the central feed of content, it was never optimized to supply news to users, because it is optimizing for people to engage with each other, to connect, to see what your family is doing. And the algorithm that powers that did not know about the specifics that are important when you look at how to distribute journalism.
No. Can I show you a picture now? Because I think for many of us, and I think that was true for you as well, this picture was published due to, it was an anniversary for the Vietnam War, and this iconic press photography from Vietnam War is historic and showed how press photography and journalism basically can change a war, can change history. And a Norwegian publisher of the Aftenposten published this, and their Facebook account was blocked because Facebook said it violated Facebook editorial content ethics standards, saying we don't allow nudity. So that was taken away. And I think, and could you talk to me about that, Jesper? How did that, because at that time you worked at Spiegel Online, how did that action make you and the rest of us editors think about the role of Facebook?
Well, I think this is a very good example of how the connection between publishers, newsrooms, and us as a platform to distribute news has evolved. If you look at this picture, the reason it was taken down at that point was it displays a nude child. And there is a clear guidance that we do not want child nudity on Facebook, because there are so many bad ways that child nudity is displayed, misused, and is definitely something that we are materially concerned about. At that point, and I think it is a good segue to talking about algorithms. At that point, the picture was identified as displaying a nude child. And by that was taken, and it was taken down because there was no context. And as we all know, journalism lives and thrives in context, nuance, culture. These are all aspects that are important to understand the role of journalism, the role of an individual piece of content from a newsroom. And the algorithm was not in a position to identify that. It required a human supervision and revision to correct that. And it is what the letter that Espen Egil Hansen at that time wrote to us, rightly so, and he published it on his front page at Aftenposten. It was a very good example and a very good trigger for us to improve these things. But the reason behind it was at no point suppressing news or journalism or filtering it. It was triggered by a total valid reason and a very important policy.
But what it did show was that Facebook, of obvious reasons, is curating content. You're allowing something and you don't allow something, which is exactly as a newsroom would do. So at this point, you moved from acknowledging that we're just a technology platform into being, we actually curate news. And actually, yes, but this week, in this December, Facebook struck a deal with most of the British press, where you now from next year will start curating news, hiring editors, Facebook editors, and picking stories that you think would be relevant, the best stories people should see, and you would in return pay these publishers for it. So you are now building a newsroom in Great Britain as you have had in the United States. Can you explain what's the background for this, that Facebook is now becoming this big newsroom, also curating news, not only with algorithms, but now also with journalists and editors?
Yes, sure. And I think this is very important and a very important step forward in our relationship with publishers internationally. I just want to go back to one element of what you just said, because I think it's very important to distinguish between curation of editorial content for the sake of distributing valid and reliable news and enforcing content policies that protect users on the platform. And what we just saw, and the reason why this happened, was due to policies that we have set, and the community standards we issue are public and they're constantly evolving, to try to find good answers on how to keep people on the platform safe while balancing it with free speech, which is incredibly difficult. Now, onto our activities around Facebook News. What we are doing is we are working with publishers in the US and now from January on in the UK to bring a new dedicated service onto Facebook that is called Facebook News. And that is all about news from vetted sources, eligible publishers, newsrooms that actually exist, that adhere to journalistic standards. And the reason we have a curation team on that is simply to ensure that the news experience on that platform is what people would want to see. I'll give you an example. So we are pretty good at surfacing and identifying journalistic content when it comes to categories, let's say sports. So when the German national team in soccer has a result of 0-6 and loses to Spain, that for an algorithm is sports news. You need to have context to understand that this news in the German market would be one of the top news of the day because you have 80 million soccer coaches discussing this the next morning. And the algorithms are not in a position to really see that context and pick these top stories. So what the curation team does, it ensures that stories that are of national importance, that have the prevalence in the discussion, are actually surfaced in the news feed. The rest will be a personalized experience that is driven by algorithms. So it is a mix, but it is primarily to ensure that this is the right pick. What these journalists don't do, they do not write, they do not edit, they don't change anything. They only make sure that we adhere to broad standards that are public to ensure that we have a balanced offering and a good news diet that is relevant to people using the platform.
And this is Great Britain. And so you have also plans of doing the same thing in big markets as Germany and France. You have tried in Australia. So far, they've said no. So it will spread this idea around the world, I guess. And just to bring
Yeah.
you into the table, Richard, this idea of paying publishers for some of the content, you're heading Google News. Are you following suit here and say we will also pay publishers for the content we use on our platform?
Well, first of all, I mean, there are obviously many, many aspects to what we do to make sure that we're doing the right thing by our users in presenting news content, and also doing all we can to support the news industry, particularly as it's going through the difficult transitions, given the disruption of the internet on their business models. You know, and we can get into all of that. You know, first and foremost, it's just continuing to do what we do to make sure that we are surfacing quality information, whether that's, you know, my purview includes surfacing of news on Google Search, on our smart devices, on Google News, on all of those platforms, that we're doing the right algorithmic job of surfacing the most relevant, most authoritative information that we can in each of those instances, and do it entirely algorithmically. You know, we're very careful in how we exercise our role in making judgments with the algorithm as to what people should see. We do resist efforts to have individuals making selections about what stories are important. We crowdsource that information. Basically, we crowdsource the decisions of editors. So, you know, when you see what's the top story on Google News, that's based on our algorithms looking at the corpus of journalistic expression, looking at in a sense, at the crowd of decision making based on editors to make a determination as to what's important and what's not. We don't want the bias of any individual hands in that process.
So you don't do any. We won't see a Google newsroom tomorrow, and your answer to the question was no. We do not have intention of paying publishers for each story that we pick for our Google News.
On the first point, correct. We do not foresee putting the human hands into these mechanisms. We've spent, you know, 15, 20 years on these different products, refining our systems to make sure that that they are equitable and fair and biased towards quality. And again, negate the individual decisions of any singular person. I mean, some folks have said, Richard, gee, you must be the most powerful person in news. And I'd say, yeah, except that I make no editorial decisions.
And you still don't want to pay for it.
Now, on the point of paying for it, look, we've invested tremendously in the news industry over the years, and we'll continue to do so. Part of that continued investment are some new programs. We have announced a new program called Showcase, where we will compensate publishers to, in a sense, enhance the presentation of their content on news services. We want to give publishers the opportunity to, in a sense, tune the presentation of their brands in packages of stories on different issues to make it more compelling to users and increase the likelihood that they will further engage, driving the business models of publishers, either through advertising or through subscriptions.
Can I get back to you, Jesper, and Facebook, because you are now hiring journalists and editors in order to find the right stories. You talked about sports stories, but the interesting thing is based on which values will you pick the top story from your news tab. You talked about sports, that's the easy one, but will you pick the story about the immigrant being a criminal, or would you pick the story of the immigrant creating his own startup and creating jobs in the country? What is the top story? These are the tough choices that editors make every day. Which story do you pick? And so it's interesting to hear the values, and also in the traditional newsroom environment, we have national press laws, and people are responsible. People can complain, and publishers can be forced to say I'm sorry and try to do things wrong, because there's a publisher who is responsible to the press law. Who is the responsible editor-in-chief of the Google, not the Google, the Facebook News tab here? Is that Mark Zuckerberg?
Mark Zuckerberg is our CEO, so essentially, eventually, he is of course responsible for everything that Facebook does. In this particular context, we, of course, have someone who's heading up our international curation team. That is Anne Kornblut, a known journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner. And she has a team of seasoned journalists around her that have developed these rules and guidelines on how we pick. Because, of course, we are aware that if Facebook goes in and starts putting this into hands of people instead of algorithms, there is an active engagement there, and that also comes with a risk. So they have worked hard and made it public what these guidelines are to choose stories on Facebook News. And I think it is very important to understand that there are a lot of things that you might do as an editor, because it might help your circulation or it might help your traffic, that are simply forbidden under these guidelines that we have, because we want to make sure that the stories that we pick reflect the factual reporting that we're having. So a good example, and we probably will talk about this in the further conversation, is what role does opinion play in all of this dilemma that we're actually looking at. So a headline that would be of an opinionated piece would not be curated under the guidelines that we have. If it is a piece that only shows one side of the medal, so does not speak about both sides of the story, it would not be curated. If it is not allowing multiple voices, if it is not sourced by independent sources and confirmed sources, it will not be curated. So there's a long list of principles that guide these selections, and it's far more technical than it actually is a pure editorial decision, because it doesn't look at the question that, is this the piece that would generate the biggest reach? It is about, does this story reflect the news discussion that is going on in a given market? And it is a very challenging task, and we're very aware of this, and we're treading very carefully around this.
Would it be fair to say that both, especially YouTube, owned by Google, and Facebook, are grandmasters in the attention economy? The business model is trying to let people stay on the platform as long as possible. So some of the algorithms in both YouTube and Facebook has been created in such a way that people get content that pleases them, that so if you click on something, you get more of the same thing, which generates these echo chambers, and that we shouldn't go into details about that, but it has consequences with that attention focus and the business model around that. And what you're saying is, will you use the same kind of thinking around the news curation? I mean, would you still go tabloid, taking stories that you think will generate most emotions, anger, joy, in order to let people stay as much as possible? Because that's the way the algorithms was built. Are you saying you're doing the same thing when it's humans, or do you do something different?
Well, first of all, I think what you're describing is probably a phenomenon that we have seen a couple of years ago, probably 10 years ago. We've come much further than that. We've made conscious decisions to actually reduce engagement, which is not necessarily in an economical interest of a company short term, but definitely on the long run is. So we want to make sure that a lot of the engagement that people have on the platform is actually meaningful to them. And as many publishers know, we've made a couple of very clear decisions in early 2018 when we prioritized content from family and friends over any other content, including publishers' content. And this was actually to ensure that the experience was not in any form highly polarized or to just keep people as long on the platform as they would. Same goes for video consumption. So we've made conscious decisions to balance that, because when you want to ensure that your users are using the platform in the long run, you want to make sure that it actually is a good experience and doesn't lead to the things that you just described. Now, on the news surface, this is a total different game, because as I said, the Facebook news feed, which is the general product, was never optimized to surface news. You would see a news piece that could be 3 days old because a friend of you has commented on it or shared it with you, and would not necessarily surface the most recent news or the most important news. So the whole product that we're building within Facebook is optimized to surface legitimate, trustworthy news from valuable sources in a way that it actually is relevant and surfaces news that are happening in the public debate or that might actually address your individual interests.
So
it is a very different way of building this, and it's a different way of ranking things.
So you would run a story that is nuanced and maybe a bit boring, but true. And you would run that, even though that people wouldn't necessarily spend so much time on it. What?
Well, I'm not heading the
curation,
but the answer is yes, because we are sticking to our guidelines, and it is not about, quite the opposite. It is not about clickbaity headlines. This is the one thing that you might be punished for, and actually eventually might lose your eligibility to be on such a surface like Facebook News.
And let's go back to that. But you should get into conversation here, Richard. I know you're not in charge of YouTube, but the algorithms there, they try to keep people on the platform as long as possible. Isn't that true?
Well, I mean, a couple of things there. I mean, first of all, in the media business in history, the objective of any media business is to keep people as engaged as possible on their products, whether that's getting people to watch 5 hours of television a day or spend an hour with the newspaper. So, you know, the notion of attention-driven economies is something that's as old as media itself. We should be clear about that. But let's talk about algorithms and information silos, because I think there are misperceptions in this regard, certainly with regard to Google. For instance, with Google search, we do not personalize search results. We do tune them various on characteristics, particularly, say, geography. If you're in Hamburg, as Jesper is, and you do a search just for restaurants, well, we're going to come back with restaurants in that area. But we do not personalize search results. And even if you look at Google News has a headlines feed, which is completely unpersonalized. We do have a personalized feed for people where we do focus on people's interest. But here too, there are some very clear guidelines. We do not personalize based on political affinity or the particular bias of an article itself. In fact, we make no efforts in our algorithmic systems to understand either the political lean of the user or the political lean of the content itself. We do seek to provide users with a diversity of content from a diversity of sources, but not based on any analysis of their political views or inclinations. I think that's hugely, hugely important. So yes, in the personalized feed, you know, I'm a woodworker, I make furniture. Yeah, I will see articles in there about woodworking, but you will not see articles in there that are based on any perception of my political beliefs.
So,
and I think that's hugely important.
Both of your companies for the last 2, 3, maybe even longer, have been putting more and more resources in to try to listen to the criticism of not spreading misinformation, trying to combat fake news and all that. And that is definitely a good idea. Also putting money into fact-checking organizations around the world. But what about the opposite? I mean, helping quality journalism, pushing up in search great journalism, making sure that people find in the sea of pollution of all kind of information and journalism, the best of it is make sure that people get that in their newsfeed, in their search. How are you working with that? And do you think that is important? That quality journalism can be found?
It's very important, and we do that in many dimensions. I mean, you know, my favorite definition of journalism is to give citizens the tools and information they need to be informed citizens. Mm-hmm. I look at Google's role in any of our products in a similar regard. Is how do we give citizens access, the ability to find and discover and utilize tools and information that help them be more informed. And we take that very seriously. And so increasingly, as we evolve our algorithmic approaches, and we have thousands of people working on this, the science here is continues to progress. We have teams looking at story understanding. How do we understand the nature of the story and its various dimensions, just so that we can, in our search experiences, for instance, and in our Google News experiences, give people on any topic a well-rounded ability to understand the story. How do they catch up with the latest breaking news? How do they understand maybe the key roles of participants? Are there interviews available with key participants in the story? Are there explainers available that help me understand the basics of the story? Might there be data visualizations available to help me understand that dimension of the story? So we do seek and will increasingly seek to give people that fully rounded ability to understand the story. So that's how we look at it from search perspective.
But wouldn't it be true for both of you that everybody can agree that it's a good idea to give people more quality? Nobody will disagree with that. But the tricky question for companies such like yours is, how do you define quality? And yes, but could you talk us through that? I mean, what is quality? Is that everything from Spiegel Online and New York Times?
That is exactly the question that we are trying to find answers to, and there is no silver bullet to that. It's like there will be no metric that we can just apply and then say this is quality and this isn't. And we're trying to find ways to increase the exposure of quality news and see how it actually interacts with users. So the effort that we're undertaking with Facebook News is one of these elements to say, can we make sure that the sources that are allowed on Facebook News are actually journalistic institutions that have a newsroom, that have standards? But we should be very clear about criteria, because if it were the three of us, we could probably agree on a set of publishers that we felt were high quality and like very good journalism.
Three gray-haired old men.
Exactly. We were like all connected to news. We're all from pretty much the same demographic. And like we are not representing the users out there. So I think it is very important to make sure that, yes, while you try to achieve that, while you try to find the good, reliable journalism, it's very, very dangerous to just apply simple metrics to then have it be a quality score of some sort and then say this is what is good and gets upranked and what isn't. And I don't think we have found the answers yet. We're trying very different things. So one is Facebook News. Another thing that we did during the pandemic or during now as a new addition, climate change, is we create hubs where we combine factual information from scientists and scientific resources with corresponding journalistic coverage, and see if we can find indicators that how that works and how it is perceived by people. But there are very many out there who have very different opinions, and we cannot just take our stance and say we make a biased choice and say this is quality and it isn't.
I think it's important to recognize that quality is a relative thing. Trust is a relative thing, right? You do surveys and ask which media outlets do you trust, and you get tremendously varied results depending on the perspectives and biases of those individuals, right? So it's important to recognize that. Now, do we do entirely in our system seek to understand authoritativeness? Where's the expertise? But it's important to recognize those bounds. I think it's important also, as Jesper was alluding, that we do our best efforts to work with the ecosystem to see how do we evolve the models and media constructs that can help address these situations, right? Google was at the forefront establishing the frameworks for the fact-checked ecosystem that has been of a significant assistance to, I think, all of us in making that content available to users as they come do a search, for instance. Is there a fact check there? That's important. Working with the industry to provide additional facility to make it easy to create explainers and other story models. Working with the industry, the Trust Project, as you know, to encourage mechanisms of greater transparency, to give users a better ability to understand the sources they are looking at. All of these and many more are crucial to us evolving not just how we take and modify our algorithms to identify the right stuff, but how can, as I say it, how can the organic construct of the internet itself heal itself by evolving new models and constructs to deal with these issues. And I think that's hugely important. These are not problems that are going to get solved by any individual company. or any individual segment of companies. I think there's a huge need, and I come out of the journalism community, for us to rethink journalism, to rethink what does it mean to provide authoritative journalistic content in our societies today that are so dramatically different than the world we lived in 40 years ago.
And we now half through the conference here, the 24 hours for the future of journalism. And basically all 24 hours, we talk about the problems we have so far and ask the questions now, what and how. What can we do to change it without violating any of the ground principles of great journalism? And this is a leading question, but instead of talking about quality, because you're both right, I mean, what is quality? That is very subjective. Could we find measures that is easy to understand? Is that fact-based? Are there several sources on this story? Is it forward-looking? What kind of wording is it using? Is it interacting with audience, or is it closing itself? All this, if you can use this matrix, stories that is focused on, that is inspirational, nuanced, and engage people in a dialogue. That's what we call constructive journalism.
Right.
If, just imagine if it was possible to come up with some kind of code book, machine learning project, an algorithm that could actually find these kind of stories and help you guys, and meaning helping audience, to find stories that were not only depressing and things about people yelling and people shooting each other, but also people trying to find out what should we do about the problems in society. Would that be of interest of companies like yours?
No question. And as you know, I mean, we've been huge supporters of your efforts with constructive journalism, and we'll continue to do so. I mean, I think that what you're doing is part and parcel to what I'm talking about, of rethinking journalism in and of itself, right? You know, as you know, there are myriad ranges of quality and approach in the world of journalism. Some of it is strongly advocacy oriented. Some of it is, you know, it's many and varied. How do we drive new thinking in that regard as well? I think that's crucial. But I don't think we're going to find a formula for the truth. We're not going to find a formula for quality. Obviously, there are certain things that are indeed core facts. We could probably agree that right now, if I looked up, that the sky is blue. But that's a comparatively small part of the information ecosystem. So much else of it is perspective. In fact, one thing that I just can't resist to point out here is, I think, one of the contributory problems of the space today is the extraordinary exponential growth in opinion content.
It's right. Because it's so easy and so cheap.
It's because it's so easy and so cheap. You know, and if you look back at a newspaper as it was constructed in 1985, right, the opinion page and the opinion were 2 pages out of 75. It was a tiny percentage. And today, you know, it's the amount of opinion content on most news sites is 3-4 times the amount of fact-based journalism. I'm not saying that opinion content is bad, but it does, I think, cause folks to have a particular challenge in understanding the credibility of the news organization itself.
Yes. Sorry.
Yes, I do agree with Richard. I think the problem that we are seeing more and more is, and research shows this, that a lot of users turn away from news sources that are more and more surfacing opinion rather than factual reporting, and not laying out the situation and explaining the situation, allowing users or readers to form their own opinion. And I think this is something that news media needs to address. And I know that very many are aware of this situation and working on it and trying to find their way. And with like the internet, including us, there's also the opportunity for pretty much everyone to publish their opinion and become their kind of own voice in this. And how do we, in all this crowded amount of content, actually identify the voices that should be heard? And I think this is one thing and one element that we need to understand. Now, to your point, I think working on indicators like you do in the Constructive Institute is really, really important. And I agree with Richard that we're not going to find that formula. I think one thing to remember, we're looking at these things on a global level. and you live in Denmark, the way that Danish journalists talk to politicians is way, way different from the way that a politician might be addressed in the US. Or if you go to the Middle East, the way that a politician might be addressed in the way that Denmark might lead to the reporter ending in a very bad place. Or it is just a very different way of surfacing news, like how drastic, how graphic can imagery be when reporting the news. There's a very cultural difference between not only countries within Europe, but around the world. So even if you would find that formula or that indicator, I doubt that it would allow us to actually apply it to the global scale and the global nuance and variety of news content out there. But this should not be reason not to try to find and address this, because I don't think this will be one thing that we all find together and then the problem is fixed. It will be a very big amount of different things, and it will require a lot of people and will require cooperation. It's nothing that tech can solve. It is nothing that probably news can solve on their own. And we need to work on this together, because I think everyone is interested in the same thing.
It's interesting you say so, because for many years in these discussions with tech companies, such like yours, each problem that has arisen on the back end of technology, the answer for many years has been more technology. I mean, have we come to a point where the solution to some of these things is not that we should spend more time on Facebook or more time on Google and YouTube? And I can put it in another way, Jesper, if you have kids, do you ever talk to your children, the teenage children, and say, I think you should spend more time on your phone on Facebook? Do you say that to them?
Well, of course not, because it's attractive and it's used amongst their friends. And it's a great tool to communicate, to keep in touch with what's happening. But I think, like with every healthy thing that you're doing, is like there's a certain amount of time that you should spend doing one thing and using one thing. And the more impressions you have, and hopefully many, many in real world, definitely are important to your personal health, and also to make sure that you have a healthy view of what's happening outside your own, like, I don't know, 4.5 inches that you look at. On the other hand, and we all know this, especially during the pandemic, using tech has helped people to stay connected, has helped people to keep their businesses afloat. So I don't think there's a black and white answer here, but is the question, would I recommend for anyone to spend like 24 hours on their phone on Facebook? Definitely not. And so will none in our company. Of course not.
Look, in the history of media here too, I mean, when I was a young kid, you know, it was about my parents trying to restrain how much television we watched, right? You've always had, you know, these challenges of how do you guide the behavior of your children? And certainly that's a valid point today as well. But on the one hand, you've got children who have productive and valued access to immense amount of good information. At the same time, you want to make sure they're not exposed to bad experiences online. You do need to give that focus. But I think, frankly, to simply suggest that this gets solved by reducing people's use to technology, I think is nonsense. I think it's a cop-out. I think we all, and I mean we all, tech companies, media companies, governments, need to step back and say, how do we adjust what we do given the challenges of the new digital world we're in?
So out here we have hopefully many young journalists, publishers, editors out there. If some of them want a future in journalism and they want to do good for society while still being in that profession, what would your single advice be, which is not only to use more technology, but what should they do when we talk about content? What was the most important thing they could concentrate on in the upcoming years? Jesper first.
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think what is important, and I strongly believe, is that good journalism, like really well-crafted journalism, has always had a life and a perspective. And I think what the challenge is like, do you as a journalist understand how to reach your audience, what is relevant to your audience, and why you have something that people actually want to read or ought to read. And it is not a question of whether this story lives on print or in a magazine or at an established publisher or something new. The core of it all is the story and the journalism around it. The rest is the infrastructure. And the media companies have established that by, of course, in the past, the printing machines, and are now at a point where they can change that and use the digital distribution into the future. But at its core, when you want to become a journalist, it will always be about your work, the story, and the relevance to your audience, and not about tweaking headlines to be clicked on or choosing an interesting picture for just the sake of it catching your attention. I don't think this is all short game. If you want to be successful, stick to the standards and try to find your way and do it in a way that actually lives with audiences today.
Thanks. Richard?
Yes. Yes, I mean, as I was saying, I mean, I think this is an exciting time to be in journalism because it's a time of reinvention. And as much as we're seeing challenges with the disruption of legacy media business models, we are seeing tremendous innovation in new news properties and new approaches to local news. So I think it's an exciting time, and I strongly encourage young people to come into the journalism space because it's an extraordinary opportunity for new creativity. In fact, that's really what we need. We need new innovation. We need new thinking. We need, and that comes in everything from, as I was saying, what are the new story forms that are necessary to connect users with the information they need? And here too, I think the younger generations are really important to us because their behaviors are clearly markedly different than the behaviors of my generation, right? So how do we evolve the methods and models of journalism? How do we develop a much closer relationship with our audiences to understand their diverse and needs and address those needs? This is no longer the day of media where you had journalistic institutions sitting up in a high place and telling everyone what they feel they should know and understand. We need much more interaction and collaboration and discussion with our users to create the kind of products and news products that they need. So I think it's an exciting time, and I think it's deeply necessary that we have the creativity of the evolving generations to help us get there.
And I thank you both for spending your time on taking part of this debate. I'm sure you're both right when you say this is the responsibility of not one single person or one single company or two, but also when we can have an open discussion and have more transparency on how do we make choices, how do we innovate, how do we put public good above our own self-interest and ideas of how many clicks, how many views, and how many dollars can we make. Then we have a conversation. So I'm sure that debate will go on, and it definitely should. And I hope both of you will be part of it and be even more transparent. And it's all about being responsible on behalf of society, isn't it? Thank you very much.